Good afternoon, everybody. This is Blake Robinson connecting through to the webinar from ICLEI Africa's offices in Cape Town, South Africa. We're very pleased to have you all join us. We've got over 40 attendees from all around the world, and we hope that this afternoon is going to be an interesting introduction to non-motorized transport and other activities happening around the continent. For those of you who don't know us, ICLEI Africa is part of a global network of over 1,500 cities, towns, and regions committing to building a sustainable future. In Africa, we have over 111 member cities, and we work in 24 countries across the continent. And we have active projects in 120 cities around Africa. This is the first webinar of TUMI's African Network, and it's organized by ICLEI in collaboration with GIZ within the framework of the Transformative Urban Mobility Initiative, which is funded by BMZ, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. This webinar follows on from the first TUMI Network of High Ambition Leaders meeting, which was held in Tshwane in South Africa in November 2018, and was attended by representatives of 20 cities from around the continent, some of whom have joined us today. During the workshop, non-motorized transport, infrastructure, policies and financing were identified as key needs of African cities. In many African cities, over 40% of daily commutes are via non-motorized transport modes, and in cities like Addis Ababa, this exceeds 50%. Often these commuters don't have the benefit of dedicated walking and cycling lanes, and risk their lives and their health by sharing the road with cars. So investments in non-motorized transport are really important in terms of building and retaining and improving the quality of walkability and cyclability in African cities. These TUMI webinars aim to bring experts together to share their thoughts and experiences in NMT in order to assist cities from Africa and further afield in implementing sustainable modes of transport that are accessible to all. Just a general note that this webinar will be recorded, and we'll make a recording available to those of you who would like to refer to it afterwards. In terms of the lineup for today, we have 4 speakers from across the continent who will be speaking to us about various aspects of non-motorized transport. Our first speaker is Stephanie Holsworth from UN Habitat, who's going to be looking at the NMT guidelines that were recently developed by UN Habitat and ITDP, which are called Streets for Walking and Cycling, Designing for Safety, Accessibility and Comfort in African Cities. This promises to be a very interesting introduction to the guidelines and will help many cities with forming a basis for starting to design NMT systems where they currently have a need for more walking and cycling. The second speaker is Sean Cook from the University of Cape Town, who's going to be looking at returns on investments in NMT, not just about the financial returns, but also the investments in terms of health and safety and other aspects that NMT brings to a city. He believes that non-motorized transport can yield the best returns of any transport infrastructure option, and it'll be interesting to hear what he has to say and how he justifies this argument. After that, we have Diana Odero from UN Environment, who's talking about implementing NMT policy in Africa and accessing financing for NMT policies. She'll also give an overview of the Share the Road program that they're working on in 6 African cities. Our fourth speaker is Amanda Ngabarano from Makerere University, who will be talking about NMT from her experience as a spatial planner, working in Nairobi and Kampala. After the speakers, at around 4:15, we'll have a few minutes for questions, and we'd like to ask you to please use the questions tab on the GoToWebinar platform. You'll see on the side there's a section that says questions, and if you can please write your question in there and indicate in brackets who the question is directed to so that we can deal with them towards the end of the session. Please keep your questions short and to the point, so that we can move through them quite swiftly. I think without further ado, we can start with our first speaker, who is Stephanie from UN Habitat. I'm going to connect through to her now. And yes, thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have an enjoyable afternoon with us.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. My name is Stefanie Holzwarth, and I work for the Urban Mobility Unit at UN Habitat. We are headquartered in Nairobi in Kenya. And as Blake has mentioned, I'll be talking about a street design guideline that we have recently developed, and am hopefully going to give you a few ideas on how to make the streets in your city more accessible and more safe for pedestrians and for cyclists. This is a photo that really much illustrates my daily life as a cyclist in Nairobi. You really need to be brave to be cycling or to be walking. However, my dream for the African continent is that the cities manage to design their roads in a way that makes them safe for pedestrians and for cyclists. One feature that causes a lot of road safety hazards is the vehicle speed. And with this graphic, I would like to show you how the vehicle speed determines the safety of pedestrians. On the left top corner, you can see the vision of a vehicle user when he drives at 20 kilometers per hour. And you can see pedestrians alongside the road. If one of those pedestrians would step onto the road space, at that very moment, those pedestrians would actually be safe. This could be kids, for example, running after a dog or running after a ball, or any other very fast-moving pedestrians that would be crossing the road. However, if you now move to 50 kilometers per hour of the vehicle, as you can see in the top right corner, you would see that the vision of the car driver has very much narrowed down, and each and every of those pedestrians would have actually been fatally hit by the vehicle passing by. So this really shows that keeping vehicle speeds low is very crucial for pedestrian and cycling safety. The same you can see here. The chance of a pedestrian being deadly hit by a motor vehicle goes from 5% at a speed of 32 kilometers per hour up to 85% at a speed of 64 kilometers per hour. Now, the menace that we are facing is that most cities around the world have speed limits in their urban areas of 50 kilometers per hour, which again poses an enormous risk on pedestrians. What do we need to make our pedestrians safer? We believe that all the roads and urban streets need slow zones. So if you have a narrow right of way, as you can see on the left side, the entire width of the road should be designed as a slow zone. That means that you reduce the speeds of the vehicles to less than 30 kilometers per hour, and you create a shared space where pedestrians, cyclists, and motorists are sharing the space. If you have a wider street and a bigger right of way, you can separate the different transport modes according to separate lanes. So we would here, for example, cater for public transport lanes, for carriageway for the motorists, but also for safe walking and cycling lanes. Blake has mentioned it in the introduction. We have recently developed a guide for streets for walking and cycling for African cities in collaboration with our partners from the Institute for Transportation and Development Policy. And I would like to briefly take you through a few design ideas from that guide. First, I would like to talk about footpaths. Footpaths, we believe, should be divided into 3 zones. We would have a clear demarcation between a pedestrian zone, as you can see in the middle. That would be a continuous space for walking that has a minimum width of 2 meters. 2 meters because 2 wheelchairs would be able to pass each other in opposite directions. This pedestrian zone should really be kept for a free flow for pedestrians without any obstacles. On the left side, we could have a frontage zone, which would demarcate a buffer between street side activities, such as cafes or shops, and the pedestrian zone. On the right side, we could have a furniture zone that could be a space for landscaping, for street benches, for lights, for bus stops, and so on, that clearly separates the pedestrian zone in a safe way from the motorized lanes. How could that look like in reality? This is a photo from ITDP from a city in India. You can see the frontage zone. You can see the pedestrian zone where there's really the assurance of a free flow for pedestrians, and the furniture zone on the right that keeps a safe distance to the motorized lane. Again, two photos left is an example, I think, from Ethiopia, from Addis, where you can see that the pedestrian zone is obstructed by, for example, a street light, but also plant pots and other utilities. On the right side, you again see a best practice example. This example is from Nairobi, where you can see again the clear demarcation into those three zones, allowing for an unobstructed flow of the pedestrians in the median. This again shows the example, as I mentioned, at least 2 meters, if not even 2.5 meters, for two wheelchairs to be able to pass each other in the median. Footpaths should in addition be elevated above the carriageway with a curb height of no more than 150 millimeters. On the left side, you can see an example from Nairobi where there's no elevation, meaning that there's a lot of dirt on the pedestrian walkway and on the cycle lane, but it could also cause, for example, waterlogging in times of heavy rains. On the right side, you see a best practice example where the walkway is elevated, and you see that the pedestrians have a pleasant and safe environment to walk. 1 second. I just need to open actually my other file. I'm just seeing that I have used an older version. All right, sorry for that. So back to the footpaths. They should also have a flat walking surface and guiding tiles that contribute to accessibility for people with disability. On the left side, you see an example from Nairobi where the drainage is really hindering an even surface, so a person in a wheelchair would not be able to use those facilities. While on the right side, you can see that there's tactile designs for example, people with visual inabilities, and you can see that they would be very safely and very easily walking on that space. Space for vending is often a question that we are asked when we talk to African government officials. One opportunity that could provide space for street vending is the giving them space on the side of the pedestrian zone. So again, as I said, 3 zones, and the pedestrian zone should be for the free flow of pedestrians, but street vending space could be given on the left side, as you can see on the picture on the right. This doesn't only enhance the local economy, but it also enhances safety for the pedestrians, because there would be a lot of ice on the streets, especially when it gets to night times. How do we deal with property entrances? The first 2 graphics that you can see are examples that we would not want to promote because they are not accessible. Just imagine a person in a wheelchair trying to get from one side of the entrance to the other side. On the first picture, it would be impossible. On the second picture, there's a ramp that takes the pedestrian onto the level of the carriageway. But also this is very much prone to waterlogging, and it would also allow for high speeds of the cars. The best example here would be example number 3, where we would be providing a continuous access and a continuous level for the pedestrians, and we would take the cars and the vehicles onto a ramp to get onto the level of the pedestrian footpaths. That would slow down the vehicle speeds and therefore enhance the pedestrians' safety that could easily be walking on a continuous footpath. How does it look like in reality? On the left side, an example that would be very challenging because the curb height of the pedestrian walkway is too high. And it would definitely not be accessible for someone in a wheelchair. On the right side, you see an example that is very well designed, where the cars are taken up on a ramp onto a slope, and therefore the speed would be reduced. How do we deal with crossings? This is a design example of a best practice crossing, where we would again keep the pedestrians at the level of the footpaths, but we would build a ramp to reduce the vehicle speed. So this is what we call at-safe crossings, where the pedestrians remain on the level that they have been, but the vehicles are taken up onto the level of the pedestrians. This is how it looks like. On the left side, I think an example again from Kenya, where there's no crossing facility being provided, and also no traffic calm measures. So this would be a very unsafe undertaking of those school children to cross that street. On the right side, we see an example from the bus rapid transit system in Dar es Salaam, where we have a pedestrian crossing that is elevated, therefore reducing the speed of the cars, hence enhancing pedestrian safety. If possible, it would also be good to avoid foot over bridges and subways. In an attempt to increase motor vehicle speeds, at-grade pedestrian crossings are frequently replaced by foot over bridges or pedestrian subways. However, these facilities are often very inaccessible and have a lot of drawbacks. Drawbacks could, for example, be increase of the travel time because people would need to be going upstairs, lack of universal access, again, because of, for example, stairs that would take you either up or down. These facilities often obstruct the footpaths. They are much more expensive than at-grade crossings. And they are also very much prone to harassments or other crimes, especially during night times. At the same time, if we keep the pedestrians either over the carriageway or under the carriageway, we are not facilitating any speed reduction of the vehicles. Here are two examples of how this could be looking like. On the left side, you can see that the foot over bridge is actually occupying the pedestrian walkway. So that's a very bad example of a foot over bridge. And on the right side, you can see that foot over bridges often also represent a wasted investment because pedestrians are still going for their desired line in crossing the streets at the easiest way, which would mean that they wouldn't even utilize the facility. Crash data for Nairobi has showed us that foot over bridges are not always preventing pedestrian deaths at the crossing locations, because just remembering the photo that I have shown you is that still, even though we have foot over bridges, a lot of pedestrians might still be using the at-grade crossing and would therefore still be exposed to a lot of pedestrian safety risks. How do we deal with intersections? This shows a safe intersection design where we would have direct, intuitive pedestrian crossings. Those should reflect pedestrian desired lines, and we should also avoid detours. So for the pedestrians, the crossings should be minimized in terms of distance, and we should also look into pedestrian refuge islands if we have a large right of way. So for example, in this case, where we have 4 lanes of carriageway, we should definitely put pedestrian refuge islands after 2 lanes, so pedestrians could stop over and take a moment of breath and then get to the other side. In addition, sharp corners forces cars to slow down. On the left side, you can see a large turning radius that would still allow vehicle speeds of around 50 kilometers per hour. And just imagine a pedestrian crossing there, he might be very much at a safety risk. On the right side, you can see a design that would make the turning radius much sharper. And that would definitely slow down the vehicle speeds to probably something around 10 to 20 kilometers per hour. And therefore, the pedestrian that would be crossing there on the zebra crossing would be much safer. This is how it looks like in reality. On the left side, again, we have a photo from Nairobi, where we have a large turning radius, and you can imagine that the truck that is on that road has a very high speed. On top of that, we can also see a lack of any pedestrian crossing facilities, such as streetlights or elevated pedestrian crossings. So this would be a very unsafe intersection for a pedestrian. On the right side, an example from Barcelona, where you can see refuge islands that offer a safe place for pedestrians to wait for the green light, because we can also see traffic signals that enhances the pedestrian safety. And we can also see that the crossing distances are chosen in a way that they are minimized. If you ask yourself how your city gets to such design features, one activity that has really been very successful in the work that UN Habitat has been doing is temporary open street or placemaking activities. Those are transition experiments where in a short term, in a temporary term, we are testing alternative street designs and alternative mobility cultures. Those are activities that really help us to activate streets as public spaces, as safe spaces for pedestrians and for cyclists. And they can be done through very low-cost interventions, such as pop-up activities. I'm going to show you a few photos before I finish my input. This is an example from Colombia, where we have done exactly what I have just explained when it comes to intersection designs. We have sharpened the radius of turning into something like a 90-degree angle. And the space that you can see in white and orange is really a space that is now given back to pedestrians, to cyclists, and to other urban residents as a leisure space, as a public space. While crossing from one side of the street into the park has become much safer because the vehicle speed has gone down. Those are examples and photos from a placemaking activity that we have done in Nairobi, where we have tested through painting how the street could be better shared among the different transport modes. So we have also, for example, provided space for cyclists and safe pedestrian crossing facilities. This is an example from Kampala, where we have tested how we can utilize streets better as public spaces for arts, for culture, for exhibitions, for painters, and it has really been a very successful exercise there. What is very important with these activities is that you link them to the plans that the city has. So, for example, in the case of Kampala, the city government already has very strong and very far advanced plans of a non-motorized transport pilot. And the street that we have chosen is actually part of this pilot and has been a very great activity for the government to sensitize the public on their governmental plans. That's the end of my presentation. If you are interested in the guidebook with the different design ideas, please visit the UN Habitat website and you can easily find it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a really interesting introduction to UN Habitat's NMT guidelines. I was wondering, I noticed that you mentioned that foot overbridges and subways were probably not worth their investment. I was wondering if there were any suggestions from the guides as to how to approach crossings over freeways, because it's a problem that we have in South Africa.
Yes, I mean, that's why we stated if they can be avoided, avoid them. But I think on freeways, it's very difficult to have at grade crossings because the speed of the vehicles is just very high, and a freeway is different in nature and different in speed and different also in kind of what it serves than, for example, an urban road. So for freeways, I do understand that it's difficult to build foot overbridges or, to build at grade crossings. But wherever they can be avoided, I would suggest to avoid them because, for example, in South Africa, I know also they're quite a safety hazard in terms of security in the night and so on.
if anybody else has any questions for Stephanie, please can you write them in the question session on the side control bar, and we'll attend to them at the end. I'm now going to hand over to Sean. Sean, are you still with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so Sean is going to talk about his work on return on investment in NMT infrastructure in African cities. Over to you, Sean.
Okay, thank you, Blake. Afternoon, everyone. I am here today to start a discussion around the benefits of walking and cycling in African cities. And so I've spent the last few years working with Kali Konanga from UN Environment, looking at how to calculate the value that pedestrians and cyclists generate for African urban societies. So I'm going to share a small bit of the work that we've done and look forward to hearing from the attendees around the value that walking and cycling have been creating in their cities. So walking is fundamental to mobility, whether as a main mode or in conjunction with other modes. However, the benefits of walking go far beyond the movement and access that it provides. The physical act of walking and the infrastructure that facilitates it provides immense value to both the individual and to society that other transport modes just do not. And this value that NMT and especially walking creates is often overlooked when only considering walking to be a mode of transport. The array of other benefits that cities are getting from walking deserves to be highlighted and celebrated. When it comes to the environmental effects of transport use, we as African cities need only look to our brothers and sisters in the global south to see what awaits in store for us and our transport choices. These two photos here were taken 10 days apart. And this was in Beijing in China. The Beijing government decided to ban 5 million cars from the roads for 10 days around a national holiday. And particulate matter in the air dropped by 73% during those 10 days. Now, since 2015, when these photos were taken, the Chinese cities have invested a substantial amount of their budget towards walking and cycling infrastructure in order to tackle this issue, among many other objectives. So when I decided to look at what the scale of the environmental benefits of walking can be in an African city, I decided to do a preliminary analysis of Lagos, Nigeria. I asked what the effect would be if 10% of the car trips in Lagos were shifted to walking by providing prioritization and infrastructure. And over a 15-year period, 4.6 million tons of CO2 would be saved, which is the equivalent of planting 177 million trees. And when you look at particulate matter, the very harmful haze from the photo from Beijing, the WHO guideline is 20 micrograms per meter cubed. And so if you take the amount of particulate matter that 10% mode shift to walking would save, it is equal to that guideline for a volume of air equivalent to 7.84 billion Olympic swimming pools. So this exercise starts to evaluate both the massive effect that car use has on our environmental health within our cities, but also the environmental value that can be generated from shifting trips out away from cars and towards walking. When it comes to health benefits of walking, these are often highlighted in the richer global north cities. But some incorrectly assume that these same benefits are not necessary in our African cities. According to some measures, South Africa and Egypt are among the 5 most obese nations in the world. And this occurred pretty recently. The rapid growth of cheap fast food and other unhealthy calories within South Africa and Egypt has created a systemic obesity problem. But it also shows the immense opportunity that other African cities have to preempt this issue by increasing physical activity through things like walking. Stephanie has very rightly touched on the other major health benefits associated with walking, and that is actually not the benefit itself doesn't have that much to do with walking. It's to do with protecting pedestrians from vehicle users. Now, as has been stated, we're going to be potentially losing millions of people on our roads over the next few years to road fatalities. And this is catastrophic both for our communities and for our economies. We often speak about the emotional toll that these deaths take on us, but rarely acknowledge the economic one, even when it comes to evaluating where we allocate our budgets. And the vast majority of these road fatalities on our continent are pedestrians. And therefore, we could be adding whole percentage points to our economic growth by investing in protecting our pedestrians. And this is especially true for protecting and supporting our young pedestrians. Amend, an organization that's working in Tanzania, has been building pedestrian infrastructure around schools for as little as $20,000 and achieving a 25% decrease in child road injuries in those areas. So we have international best practice happening here on our continent at a relatively low cost. Now, some of the benefits of investments in walking and cycling can't be easily quantified or monetized, such as the social benefits. But those benefits can be measured through interviews and surveys and other qualitative techniques. And a holistic picture of the effects of our public investments is critical to creating resource-efficient and productive cities. Whereas some of the benefits of pedestrian investments are already monetary. The city of Bogota in Colombia built a 370-kilometer network of walking and cycling infrastructure. And they've estimated that the families that use that infrastructure save around $2,000 per year due to lower transport costs. Now, that is money that those families could be spending on their children's education or in starting a business. So pedestrian infrastructure can actually be an efficient way to redistribute wealth and promote economic growth within a city. Now, all of this work has culminated in a project assessment tool that we built specifically to evaluate the benefits of investments in walking and cycling in African cities. I validated this tool by analyzing that walking network in Bogota. And as the first project, I've evaluated what the potential benefit would be of replicating that successful 370-kilometer network in Cape Town and in Nairobi. So the values you can see on your screen now are the values of benefits per US dollar that would be invested in building this walking and cycling network. And it's been accounted for the local construction costs. You can see that Cape Town and Nairobi on average could be saving 3 times the amount of CO2 that Bogota has in the last 20 years with its network per US dollar invested. And the percentages above these values represent the proportion of the total emissions from the passenger transport sector that would be avoided through a relatively small investment in a 370-kilometer network. So you can see that up to and above 5% of the CO2 emissions and the petrol used by the transport sector within both Cape Town and Nairobi could be saved just through having a coherent walking network. Now, the health benefits of this kind of pedestrian network have shown to be equally impressive. Cape Town could be saving 10 lives per $1 million invested in a network like this. And as the average contribution to the economy of a person who lives in Cape Town is around 1.3 million US dollars, that means that the economic return on the investment could be tenfold, purely based on preventing the road fatalities. And similarly in Nairobi, because there aren't yet that many dedicated walking facilities, a network like this could significantly improve the travel times of pedestrians, saving approximately 390 years of travel time per $1 million invested. That time could be dedicated to economically productive work to generate additional income. So finally, if you examine the benefit to cost ratio of these three networks, and you only look at travel time savings, which is common in many cities when it comes to evaluating transport projects, you'll see that only the network in Nairobi would be seen to break even. And none of these networks would be seen to be high value, which is a benefit cost ratio of 2 or more. But if you include the non-mobility related benefits that these cities would derive from this pedestrian infrastructure, you can see that a holistic benefit cost ratio would be much higher. And this finding is not unique to our study. I've included a random selection of benefit cost ratios from other pedestrian projects, and that you can see it ranges from around 1.5 in Amsterdam, who already have a lot of walking infrastructure, and so each additional kilometer doesn't generate that much value. But in a city like Cape Town or Nairobi or Delhi, where pedestrian infrastructure is in such high demand and could make such a huge impact, the return on this investment is likely to be among the highest of any investment that a city makes. And when I was looking at the most kind of comprehensive review that I could find of pedestrian and cycling infrastructure investment so far, which is Davis 2010, she said that the economic justification for cycling and walking projects is rarely even considered in public policy decision making, let alone quantified. So even though she found that the average benefit to cost ratio of pedestrian projects around the world was about 13:1, the average return on investment for road projects is less than 2. So investing in walking infrastructure and walking programs could be generating the best returns of any investment that a city makes, and especially African cities. And so this is the justification, as Blake describes it, for my belief that cities should be advancing as quickly as they can to invest in pedestrian infrastructure to generate the most value that they can for the citizens who have provided them that budget. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. That was a really interesting overview of some of the numbers behind these investments in NMT. And I think it's particularly interesting from an African perspective to see how investments in NMT can actually help to reduce gaps between the rich and the poor, and how they can help with a number of other factors like health and safety and environmental impact. I was wondering, in terms of trying to build support for these types of investments, do you see other sectors of society, like the health sector, or people looking at community safety and things like that, getting involved in advocating for NMT? Are there some unusual suspects who are starting to get involved in the argument for NMT around the continent?
Yeah, thanks, Blake. That's true. I think that because once we can determine how cross-sectoral and cross-cutting these benefits are, you do start to coalesce an unlikely kind of coalition in favor of walking and cycling infrastructure. And one of the more famous examples in Cape Town is the violence prevention through urban upgrading project, where they were investing in public space and largely in pedestrian infrastructure with the idea that it would reduce safety concerns and violence within communities. And they've had immense success at reducing that violence. And so we have been able to partner with them through and tap into funding that has been earmarked to safety and security concerns by acknowledging that pedestrian infrastructure is among the best return for both their sector and for ours.
That's encouraging to hear. I think that the more the topic can be spoken about and promoted from different sectors of society, the more likely we are to be able to make progress. Many countries are starting to implement NMT policies, but it's the action on the ground and translating policies into action that's often the stumbling block. We're now going to hand over to Diana, who's going to talk to us more about implementing policy and accessing finance in innovative ways for NMT. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you so much, Blake, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Diana Odero. I work as a program management assistant in UN Environment Share the Road program. In this program, we are so passionate, just like Sean, we are passionate for people who walk and cycle. And so we work with governments and key stakeholders to push for investment in infrastructure for walking and cycling. So, because we know no matter where you live or how you travel, everyone begins and ends each trip as a pedestrian. Wherever we go, whether you're going to the airport, you're going to work, whether you're going to the taxi, somehow you will walk to where it is you're going. And in cities across the world, many people rely almost exclusively on walking and cycling as their primary forms of mobility to get to work, to get to school, to get to the market. I'm going to give you a case study of Michael. Michael is a boy from Ghana who is 10 years old. His father works for a trader in car spare parts, and his mother has a small business selling disposable cups, plates, and cutlery. Michael is a bright boy. The teachers have seen that. He has a very promising future. However, there was a day that Michael was involved in a road accident. The driver of the public bus was going so fast, and he did not see Michael. This was around home time when he was coming home from school. And around this time, the roads are busy. The children are jumping up and down, trying to find their way. And because the driver did not see Michael, Michael was dragged along underneath the vehicle for several meters before it eventually came to a stop. Michael was rushed to hospital. He remained in hospital for 2 months and had 2 major operations. Today, Michael is unable to walk properly. He's unable to play the way he used to play with his friends. And his biggest concern, considering he spent 2 months in hospital, for a boy who really loved to study, for a boy who was very bright, his biggest concern is not to fall behind in school. Now, Michael's case is not an isolated one, because according to analysis from the Global Burden of Disease, more than 85,000 of African children and youth are killed or seriously injured on the continent's road each year. Road fatalities are the top 5 cause of death for children over 5 years in many African countries. And based on the WHO fatality data, the Global Road Safety Report, and scaling it up using the UN population projections, currently the fatality rate is 5.2 million children will die on African roads between 2015 and 2050. And this is really startling and shocking because this figure is equal to all the children currently alive in those 8 European nations combined. We understand a lot of challenges we have on our roads. We understand we've looked at the road safety. But no, millions of people, just like Sean mentioned in his data, millions of people die because from outdoor pollution. We have 3.7 million premature deaths worldwide in 2012. And if that was not enough, vehicle emissions are also fueling climate change. As we speak today, transport sector is responsible for 27% of energy-related carbon dioxide emissions globally. So as Share the Road, what is our aim? What are we doing about it? So as Share the Road program, we work to encourage governments to move away from the old no equity way of prioritizing the minority, which is car users, towards providing for the majority. These are people who walk and cycle. In our part of the world, the developing countries, majority of people are people who walk to work, people who cycle to work. Those people do not own cars. Providing infrastructure for the poorest is a sign of cities' equity. A bike lane shows that a citizen on a $30 bicycle is equally important to one in a $30,000 car. That is what we stand for, and that's what we believe in. Why do we push for this? Because people also need infrastructure. If you look at the screen before you, we have pictures on the left and pictures on the right. The photos on the left show how there was no infrastructure for those who are walking, and look at the population that is walking. There was no infrastructure. They are sharing this road space with vehicles. If you look at the same photo on the right, you see there's an attempt of provision of infrastructure whereby there's an elevated pedestrian walkway, at least, which it's not the perfect scene, but at least there's a difference. It is clear that there's this segregation for pedestrians. And same with the picture at the bottom. We have a child who is happily cycling in a place where previously there was no cycling lane. So the role of policy is that policy gives direction, policy shows commitment. Policy, the process of developing the non-motorized transport policy is also as important as the output itself. Key to our work is putting in place walking and cycling policies at national and cities level. We engage both the federal governments and we engage both even the county governments. We are often asked why we need standalone non-motorized transport policies and why it cannot just be included in a wider transport policy. When you look at the lack of provision for pedestrians and cyclists, integrating the needs into wider policy is not working. Until they're prioritized, until we see that the citizen who actually walks, the citizen who actually cycles to wherever it is they want to cycle, is also prioritized properly, we will have to continue to push for these policies and to bring to attention their needs. Why is it important that the policy itself, what is more important, I beg your pardon, that the policy itself is the journey to get there, bringing the decision makers in government and at national level together with city level governments and others such as academia, private sector, and of course, civil service, civil society and citizens. We understand that the policy gives a public commitment to change and can often include critical fiscal measures because the financing has to be involved as well. Policy, again, as a role, it shapes cities. They help introduce behavior which moves from one end, from the city of cars, all the way to the city of places. And in the city of places, we have space allocated for the public. There's space allocated for street activities, just the way we were shown by Steph previously. And there's traffic restraint, the reduction of speeds on vehicles. And also transit-oriented developments, where there's mixed-use developments. There's a lot of activity going on. Basically, it's a city where it's all inclusive. When we come to financing, first of all, our work in Share the Road program, we work in 7 African countries. So far, we have worked to develop non-motorized transport policy in Kenya, Uganda, Nigeria. Currently also working we've developed the NMT policy for Lagos, and we want to do it countrywide. And that is so encouraging because it's the citizens, the government that actually prompted for this to have a nationwide policy for non-motorized transport in the whole of Nigeria. We've worked in Ghana, we've worked in Zambia, Rwanda, and Ethiopia. Now, of course, policies are all key, but it cannot be done without financing. Without financing, policies cannot become a reality. And some examples of financing measures for NMT, I'll give an example for Nairobi. Right now, Nairobi's non-motorized transport policy, there's a ring fencing of an amount of 20% of all the road construction budget dedicated to non-motorized transport. So as citizens and as governments and as stakeholders, we have to be very deliberate when it comes to non-motorized transport. We have to make commitments And we have to align that within the policies that we are developing, financial commitments. Because within Nairobi, 50% of the people walk and cycle in Nairobi alone. In 2015, 700 people died on the roads, with 500 of them being cyclists and pedestrians. So the ring fence of 20% of every road construction budget to cater for non-motorized transport is a positive step. And that is encouraged, that wherever we develop the NMT policy, there has to be a commitment for financing. A country where we have just supported development of national walking and cycling policy is Zambia. And another way of encouraging financing is through private sector partnership. Because in Zambia, the city government of Kitwe, where Mayor Christopher Changombe launched the Pave Kitwe project to build high-quality pedestrian walkways, the mayor himself secured private sector funds to cover the cost of materials, while the city government supplies labor. So that is a very good example of public-private partnerships where we can work together for a common goal. We need to have everybody involved, because even the private sector itself, those are key stakeholders. They also use the roads. And so for sure, when we are proactive, when we make that deliberate effort to engage them, that's a way of also getting financing. And not forgetting the role of international development, the role of development partners as well. Because an example in Nairobi, this is a good example where the EU has a particular project purely focused on filling in the NMT missing links. So in the screen, you can see the particular corridors they are working on, Mauritania State Enterprise Road. So that's a development partner's role. They can take up and actually provide millions of dollars on public transport and road expansion projects, but what they need more is NMT inclusion. So even as they provide finances for road expansion, there has to be that NMT inclusion, which must be part of the project. And as the government itself needs to advocate for this so that it influences the national budget. And when we talk of non-motorized transport financing and policy, we don't need to think very far. Another approach is to start small. Don't think about the whole city, but rather particular areas which urgently need support. And one key example, just the way I started with the story of Michael, we can look around our school zones. Children have every adult has a soft spot for children. And that is a good place to start. Around our school zones, one focus can be on child health and mobility, mapping out schools and providing funding around school, traffic calming measures, NMT facilities, and low speed zones. Much of this can be done at low cost. So at whatever level of influence you're at, there's a place you can start. And as city leaders, what can you do as city leaders? You can start by leading by example. Before asking for national funds, show also that you are committed at a city level, at a street level, at a corridor level. Give examples of what it is you have done within your environs. Put in a place, a policy, and a ring fence at city level first. Another thing, we can showcase projects, just the way I've mentioned. You can showcase the projects that you have engaged in. It is useful to show national level what good NMT facilities look like and collect data. There's power in collaboration as well. We can develop relationship with civil society, give citizens a way of feeding into government projects, talk to the private sector and see what they can do. Bike share schemes are also good examples of joint working with private sector. So there's power in collaboration. There are people we can all work with to make this a reality. And again, another thing, we can start small. We can focus on schools or a particular area in the city where there is a big informal settlement. We can start one project at a time. And again, we need to understand the national system and your way into lobby for national funds, because that in itself needs understanding. It needs a process. Get involved in the development partner project cycle so you get to understand what it is that is needed, what was done before, what worked, what did not work. And with that, I thank you for that. I'll end my presentation there.
Great, thank you very much, Diana. That was a really interesting insight into NMT around the continent. I was wondering, you mentioned private sector partnerships. What kind of formats or interactions are there with the private sector? I mean, do you work through non-profit organizations, or does UN Environment itself approach private sector? How do those interactions normally take place in terms of attracting investment?
UN Environment works with all organizations, both the private sector and the non-private sector. I'll give an example. For example, the bike share schemes. We can have private sectors that are advocating for sustainable mobility. We share the same vision, we share the same goals. And the private sector can also work with UN Environment. For example, the bike share scheme, the Mobike, for example, within the UN Environment, within the UN office here, we have more bikes. That's because as we are promoting sustainable mobility, the bikes within the UN compound were donated to UN Environment by the private sector Mobike. And this was because we welcome all forms of private sector partnerships, as long as we are focusing on the same goal. We're promoting sustainable mobility. And so that's a way of working towards the same goals. That's why I'm saying when it comes to development of sustainable mobility, our partners themselves, whatever angle they want to come with, they're able to partner with UN Environment.
Thanks, Dan. It's encouraging to see that there are many different levels at which interventions can take place, and that it's not all the responsibility of local governments, but that local governments can work with private sector and other sectors of society to achieve change on many different points of intervention. I'm now going to hand over to Amanda, who's going to be looking at the neglected popular mode beyond infrastructure. Over to you, Amanda.
Thank you, Blake. My name is Amanda once again, and I'm happy to be part of this webinar. I'm a cyclist, so I'm not going to speak about cycling. I have spoken a lot about it, so it's going to be mainly about walking, which I believe was around before we even saw cities in place. We all walk. In the city of Kampala, in Nairobi, the majority of people are walking. So sometimes they don't understand what we are talking about when we are telling them to walk, or when we tell the leaders that walking is good. They kind of feel, yeah, we walk. But the situation under which we walk is what is lacking or is not really pleasant. So we are lucky that we are still green. In fact, if we are to talk about green cities in terms of mobility, Kampala, I think, is one of them, because the majority are still walking, and the motorized transport is about 10% only, and 60% is actually active mobility, mostly walking, and some people are cycling. As we move around our streets, we see scenes like this. They look like some movies, bad short movies. This is like a whole family crossing a road that performs like a primary road, actually, because it connects to Nairobi, to Mombasa. And there is no facility for people to cross. Like Stefan mentioned, there's a footbridge somewhere there, but there's a market across this road. And there are also schools somewhere close by, so it's difficult for people to use that footbridge and go the other side. So it's generally unsafe to walk, and that's why when people see corporates walking here, they ask them why they are walking. Even when we have some space in most of our African cities, we realize that the space is being competed for by other motorized transport vehicles, like buses even. So it's something that we have the walkways, but then we cannot actually have them. They don't belong to us. They belong to someone else who is now using the road, as you can see. We all know this happens. And when there's any funding that is available for road infrastructure, it's always easy for the motorway to have attention compared to the walkways. And in such a case, when the road is busy, this was taken on a Friday and it was a public holiday. This road otherwise is never like this, it's always busy. When it's busy, you see also that the bad walkway, the missing walkway will actually be occupied by a vehicle. So this pedestrian that you see, that lady could most likely go in the trench. And that's very unsightly, and it looks like it's not really urgent, as Sean mentioned. The importance, relevance of active mobility has not yet been appreciated by the governments. Some walking facilities look like this. Actually, here there's no walkway at all, and sometimes vehicles kick us out of this space. And we have to find our way somehow to manage. And this goes on, it becomes a normal thing for people to do. And we feel like sometimes we are cows, excuse me. So the thing is that the pedestrians also over time take this as something normal. They pity themselves and know that in an African city, in my city, this is how walking is. I don't maybe deserve better. So there's kind of some level of lack of knowledge, of awareness that there should be something like a walkway. But then the other things that when roads are being designed and constructed, what we see on paper is not normally what is actually implemented. So there seems to be a gap in terms of monitoring of road construction projects to make sure that they actually look like what they're supposed to look according to the plan. In Uganda, we have a policy, thanks to UNEP. The policy has been around, I think, since 2012 or 2013. Some of it has been implemented in Kampala. The new roads, most of them have walkways, good walkways actually. But in most of the country where other road construction projects are taking place, it's not known. And where there are some road networks being implemented, the walkways are not consistent, they are discontinuous. They don't take care of the disabled people or people with reduced ability to move, say people on wheelchairs. They consider everybody to be a normal human being who is in a good state or health or physical state to move, so that the walkway sometimes just breaks and is discontinuous. So the infrastructure is being addressed somehow. Like I mentioned, in Kampala, most of the streets on new roads, expanded roads, are getting walkways, but still they don't belong to the pedestrian. Someone else feels that they belong to them, another road user. So the pedestrian is again pushed off the road, and sometimes we are engaged in actually fights, physical fights, as we ask these people to get off the road, the vehicles to get off our part of the road. So it's infrastructure, yes. And here infrastructure is also there, where you see the motorcycles, we have a good walkway, which has been attacked and encroached upon by motorcycles who feel that they should keep moving. They don't want to stop at all. So the pedestrians are again kicked off the road. I think we're going to get wings for our pedestrians so that they can fly off the walkways and be safe when such things happen. And this was in Nairobi. I guess Diana and Stephanie can recognize that. Somewhere we took a walk and we couldn't cross this part of the road. We were just on our own. And then we were thinking about this facility being nice. It looks like it's a cycling lane. How can a bicycle pass over this trench? So there seems to be lack of plan and idea of how to do it, or carelessly doing it, or doing it as a by the way. It has to start from the beginning, as Stephanie mentioned, and it's nice that we can now have a manual to guide all this. But the gap will still remain in monitoring and evaluation to assess if it's being done correctly or not. So it's all beyond infrastructure. We have an aspect of the last and first mile in most of our cities. The first mile is mostly not in a good condition. And this mile, the pedestrian could do it because they have no choice or they are close to the station. But over time, it is a cause for a need to move in another way. And this last mile has to be given attention to be attractive to the pedestrian as well, not only for the car network. If it's not fixed, I'm afraid that we'll have more people choosing to buy cars because of just the last mile, because people tend to leave very early in the morning and then return late in the evening when it's dark. And so they feel safer to move in another way, not as pedestrians. If we don't address this issue together with the safe walkways, I'm afraid that we will no longer be the walking city that we are. We will lose the pedestrians that we have now to other modes of transportation, particularly private motor transport, because they are going to desire a movement or mobility in a more convenient way at their own time, their own pace, and we will lose them actually. So that's my worry, and for other people that I'm working with here. The land use design is also lacking because homes are completely scattered. There's no connection conveniently with the markets, with schools. So this actually discourages people that should be walking from walking. There has to be some land use design element that encourages densification, compact planning to bring facilities closer together than further apart. So this is to show you the last and first mile state of the road. Sometimes when it rains, some of these roads flood and some are so dusty when it is a hot season, and this cannot be bearable. Someone will definitely not be a pedestrian forever if this kind of last and first mile is left to be like this. We have infrastructure changes taking place, but mostly within the CBD. People don't sleep in the CBD, they come away from the CBD. So what's the state of the roads away from the CBD? I think now cities have to redivert their investments also to that other distance from homes, so that the CBD doesn't just get people that should fly there. So because of the habits that people are accustomed to, infrastructure alone, which is hardware, is not enough. We have to cooperate with civil society, governments, and then the private sector. And then we have to include elements like software, which has to do with culture, education, awareness creation, mindset change. For instance, we carried out that placemaking week together with UN Habitat in Kampala. It was kind of an awareness creation activity. Last Sunday, we held a car-free day, which was the 4th car-free day in Kampala, and we also held it along the same street where the implementation of NMT pilot project is taking place. And the road was closed off for about 5 hours off for cars, and everybody was happy with aerobics, dancing. So this, with time, people are discussing, what do you mean by car-free zones? Do you want to kick us out of the city? And with time, this mindset change will help the infrastructure to be meaningful and will enable the agencies that are working together to proceed and be able to see their goals really taking effect. What I don't understand is why pedestrians are not catered for. Is it about money? Is it about prioritization? Is it about the lack of voice from the pedestrians? Is it the comfort? Or nobody is concerned? So this, I don't know. I don't have its answer, because we have 60% of pedestrians, and then we don't see even 40% of the investment going to them. We may not even be able to successfully explain things like air pollution, that when you have more pedestrians, you have a better air quality, because it doesn't seem to be an issue yet that people are discussing things like air quality. The main thing that is being discussed now is traffic congestion. When people are complaining about traffic congestion, the next project one is likely to hear is the road expansion, additional lanes. But when people complain about road safety, and you will not see this coming up, and then you have pedestrian walkways being expanded or created. So there seems to be a problem somewhere. Walkability in African cities is generally something that we have to talk about in another way. We cannot say we have to encourage people to walk. People are walking. We have to encourage cities to work with them in terms of infrastructure provision, that people that are walking right now should feel treated as human beings deserving the dignity that they should have. And then this can enable us reduce on the number of people acquiring private cars because of the state of the walking facilities that we have. And currently, this is the project that is being implemented. In fact, implementation started from this part of the road. And if you go down the valley where you see a lot of vehicles, across is where we held the placemaking week and the coffee day last Sunday. So I hope I can invite all of you to come to our city when this is done and looks like this, for pedestrians having their own space, the green areas, and then cyclists having their space, and a few cars, of course. We can't kick the cars completely out. Thank you very much. Happy to connect with you all.
Great, thank you very much, Amanda. That was a really interesting look at what's happening in Kampala and in your local area. I was wondering, you had some really good photos there, and I noticed in one of them you had a picture of the stormwater drains, which I remember noticing in Uganda as being quite a large feature of your roadscapes. And I was wondering if there were any efforts to work with the stormwater design to try and make those more friendly to pedestrians, so that not as much of the road is taken up by the ditches.
Yeah, there's now a plan by the city authority to cover most of those trenches, so that they actually create more space for the walkways, not just for safety of pedestrians, but to be walkways, because they don't have the walkways now.
Okay, no, that's good to hear, because it really does take up a lot of the road when there's ditches on either side that make them difficult to walk through. We've got a few minutes for questions, and we've had some come throughout the presentations, and I'm going to address them to the speakers where I can identify which speakers they're for. The first question's for Stephanie from Cedra Mensa, who asks, even if they're not presenting all casualties, overbridges are less expensive to rebuild than the whole street. Wouldn't it make more sense to nudge pedestrians into using these overbridges? Stephanie, can I direct that one to you?
Yes, sure. I know the discussions about overbridges always is very heated, and there's a lot of different views on them. I think what we should be comparing here is the cost of overbridges versus the cost of at-grade crossings. And then I think it's quite obvious that an at-grade crossing would be less costly. However, as mentioned before, at-grade crossings might not be the safest means, especially when we have freeways and high-speed streets. So that discussion, I think Sean also had that discussion before, and they did some studies at the university. Maybe he also wants to comment.
Yes, I can comment briefly on the work that my colleague Mark did. They did work out that that in most of the places that foot overbridges were being proposed, the speed of the cars didn't warrant the amount of infrastructure. And but at the same time, we found that the security issues around foot overbridges in South Africa meant that people didn't even use them on the highways, that they would still rather cross the highway with protection than take the foot overbridge and risk being attacked by somebody who wants their mobile phone. So there's no simple solution when it comes to urban highways, but I think you should also caution us about building urban highways in the first place.
Thanks, Sean and Stephanie. I've got another question here for Stephanie from Wilberforce Chege, who asks, Do most city streets, say in Nairobi or Addis, for example, have enough space reserved for the 3 pedestrian zones and other NMT uses? If they don't have enough space, how do we create more space from these narrow streets?
Thank you for that question also. I would say there's a big difference between the inner city streets and the streets in the outskirts. My experience is mainly fed by my living in Nairobi. So if I look at the city center, the CBD of Nairobi, the streets can be somewhat narrow. But if you compare now the amount of pedestrians on those streets versus the amount of cars on those streets, it would very much make a justification why we need more slow zones. So we shouldn't be allowing the cars to go at 50 kilometers per hour on those streets while we have masses of pedestrians that are crossing and squeezing themselves to the side. When you look at the outskirts, especially, I would say there's a lot of very wide streets. For example, in Kenya, we have a lot of 4-lane up to 12-lane so-called highways. But I would also say that those highways have become very much urban roads because there's been a lot of urban development happening along those corridors. So still allowing them to be highways and allowing that high speed while we're not catering for pedestrians, while there would be a lot of space, obviously, on a 12-lane highway to take away at least 2 lanes, we would still have 10 lanes for the cars and maybe 2 lanes for pedestrians or for buses. I think that would make a lot of sense. So I don't necessarily think it's a matter of space. I think it's rather a matter of allocating the space to the majority of the people and the majority of the transport users, according to if they walk or if they drive or if they cycle or if they use public transport.
Thanks, Stephanie. And one last question from Mohammed Asawi, who asks, several countries in Africa are engaged in developing national policies for urban mobility. To what extent should developed countries intervene to help African countries to promote walking in African cities? Or should it just be a matter of investment from local governments and our national governments?
That's a very good question. I would say there is a lot of good lessons to be learned from different countries in the world. What I would say is very fortunate that we now also have very many good practice examples of good policies and good design features from the African continent. So I would say that especially now that we have those examples being implemented here, we should also look at them. One of those examples that I would like to refer to is Dar es Salaam, that has a newly operating bus rapid transit system with a very well-designed street space, also allowing for very safe access of pedestrians, for example, to the public transport stations. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from examples in the country, in the continent, but there's also obviously a lot of good lessons from other places in the world. And in UN Habitat, for example, we have organized a few study tours to different places in Europe or Latin America, where they have best practice examples to look at, but those ones obviously always need to be adjusted to the local context that we have here. And that local context might mean that, for example, we have the feature of street vending, the feature of motorcycles, which maybe in other parts of the world is not a feature in the street space. So those design ideas always need to be adjusted locally.
Thanks, Stephanie. And then one last question from Sukma. Are there any recommended standard design guidelines for pedestrian subways or overpasses that she can refer to? In her city, they've got a challenge with pedestrian access around railway crossings. And she was wondering if there are any specific design guidelines that she could refer to.
I personally don't have those design guidelines. I'm not sure if maybe some of the other speakers would have access to them.
Okay, maybe that's something we can get back to Sukma on afterwards. Okay, and then the next question's for Sean. Sean, we have a question from Bronwyn who asks, how viable is the percentage shift to NMT that you have analyzed? What percentage of trips are currently driven and how many are short enough to shift to walking? Presumably in Nairobi and Cape Town.
Thanks. Thank you, Bronwyn. Good question. So in the Lagos example, I think the current mode share for driving is around 27%. So we were looking at a 2.7% shift of all trips to walking. And obviously in Cape Town, it is much higher, around 60%, and in Nairobi, much lower. But what I was trying to analyze, obviously trying to shift people out of their cars is very difficult because we haven't gotten to a point where we are adequately applying the cost of car use to the use of the car. And so people don't have the right incentive to move back to walking once they've bought a car. It's kind of a sunk cost. But what we have been looking at is how to slow the rate of motorization. And there, especially in cities where the mode share of cars is still quite low, as Amanda mentioned Kampala, there's an immense opportunity to derive a lot of benefit by slowing the rate of motorization, or hopefully capping that motorization peak at a much lower level than it would have originally. And that could generate far more benefits than trying to get the current car users to shift to walking. And so that's why I said there's an immense opportunity for most African cities now to really get a very high return on investment by providing good pedestrian infrastructure so that people are less inclined to make that move and sink that investment into a car by providing better infrastructure and through prioritizing NMT, especially around the job centers.
Thanks, Sean. And then there's another question here from Emmanuel John, who asks, if you are using software for calculating the economic benefits of walking and cycling, some of the software is quite demanding on the researchers. Is there any readily available or accessible softwares that you've used or that you know of?
Yes, actually, that's why I built this tool in the first place. Was I was using, for example, for generating the environmental benefits, there's a tool called TEAMP, the Transport Emission Evaluation Model for Projects, that Clean Air Asia and ITDP created, but it is quite data intensive, as is the World Health Organization's Health Economic Assessment tool that you can use to determine the health benefits of walking and cycling. And so I took the versions of those tools and one or two others and simplified it down as much as I could, making, in some cases, cruder assumptions than the global north academics or researchers were willing to make, but so that we could get to a tool that is readily applicable to most African cities. And so that is the NMT project assessment tool. And in fact, it is available online, although at the moment it is just in Microsoft Excel format. And so if anyone wants to get in touch with me, Blake, I'm sure you can put my details up. I can send you a stable version of the Excel tool that you can try out, and I can answer any questions, hopefully. But then on the next project, UN Environment, we're hoping to create an online version of this tool to make it more readily available.
Great, thanks, Sean. Yes, if anybody is interested, you can contact us via TUMI-network@icli.org, which is TUMI-network@iclei.org. We're running a bit short on time, so I'll do one last question quickly. Question for Diana from Lena. In your experience, what works best to convince decision makers to allocate the funds and attribute the necessary attention to improving NMT infrastructure? Diana, are you there? Okay, we might have lost Diana. I think just in terms of time, I'm going to end the questions there and then follow up afterwards with the remaining questions. Just a short note before we sign off. For those cities who are looking for funding for projects, particularly in relation to the child safety that Diana mentioned, there's a new funding opportunity that's just become available from the National Association of City Transportation Officials, NACTO, who are currently accepting applications for cities interested in receiving trainings and technical assistance as part of its Streets for Kids program. There is up to $20,000 available to support the implementation of child-friendly projects, and the projects must be implemented within a 6 to 12-month period. Applications are due by 26th of February, so there's about a month left for applications, and you can find out more at nacto.org or on the TUMI Network platform. A short note about our next webinar, which will be coming up on Thursday, the 7th of March, at the same time. Please make a note of it in your diaries, and we'll send you an invitation shortly. And the topic of that workshop will be creating a walking and cycling culture in African cities. So it will be similar in theme to this one, but looking more at culture and events like open streets, which we heard earlier have happened recently in Kampala, Nairobi, and in Cape Town. So thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. We hope that you learned something, and we look forward to seeing you soon at the next webinar. Thank you.